February 1945, near the end of the war in Europe. Along the Rhine in western Germany, snow is melting into mud around a band of forest called the Reichswald. Behind those trees, German units that have been battered but can still fight are dug in. Facing them is a mixed Allied force under a quiet Canadian general, Harry Crerar, about to begin Operation Veritable with one of the heaviest British artillery barrages in the West since El Alamein. If the Allies can break through this forest and clear the Rhineland, they open the road into the heart of Germany. If they fail, the war on this front drags on, and Canada's largest land campaign in Europe risks turning into a costly dead end. In the days that follow, 1st Canadian Army under Crerar drives into the Reichswald with an artillery-heavy, casualty-conscious approach that clashes with Bernard Montgomery's pressure for faster advances. While across the line, Kursk students, paratroopers, and other German formations fight to hold the last ground west of the Rhine. To understand how Crerar and his army ended up at the edge of the Reichswald, we need to look at what had happened on the Western Front in the months before. The German Ardennes offensive, remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, had failed, but it had cost the Allies time, fuel, and men. The front then stabilized along the rivers and forests near the German border. Towns and villages lay in rubble, and the roads were clogged with the remains of months of fighting. For Allied planners, the problem was now simple to state: how to get across the Rhine and into Germany itself. For the British and Canadian forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the first step toward that goal was a large clearing operation in the north. His 21st Army Group planned to drive German forces back from the west bank of the Rhine, secure the approaches, and then cross the river on ground and at a time of their own choosing. The northern arm of that plan was Operation Veritable. On paper, the outline sounded simple enough. Allied forces would launch from the Dutch and German border near Nijmegen, drive southeast through the Reichswald forest and the towns of Cleve and Goch, and clear the ground between the Maas and the Rhine, so that they could approach the river on relatively firm footing. In practice, this meant forcing an advance through flooded lowlands and thick woodland against some of the most experienced troops the German army still had in the west. On the German side, the main formation covering this sector was 1st Parachute Army. It was not a single mass of tens of thousands of paratroopers in one forest, as later popular accounts sometimes suggest. By early 1945, it was a composite force made up of several Fallschirmjäger divisions, regular infantry divisions, training and replacement units, and whatever tanks and guns could still be assembled. It was short of fuel and short of air support, but many of its units had long combat experience, and the command expected them to fight hard. The origins and outlook of this army were closely associated with one senior officer. General der Fallschirmtruppe Kursk Student had been an important figure in the development of German airborne forces. He had overseen the early airborne operations in the Netherlands and the campaign for Crete, and he had helped shape the paratrooper arm into light infantry that often fought on the ground rather than from the air. Units under his influence had built up a reputation for stubborn defense in places like Monte Cassino and Ortona, and contemporary Allied accounts described them as formidable opponents who were both feared and respected. By the time Operation Veritable began, however, Student was no longer the man directing operations on that part of the front. He had previously commanded 1st Parachute Army and then Army Group H in the Netherlands, but he had been moved on from Army Group Command shortly before the Rhineland battles. The day-to-day control of 1st Parachute Army in the Reichswald now rested with General Alfred Schlemm. Students' earlier doctrine and training standards had helped to shape the paratrooper formations, but it was Schlemm and his staff who had to use them to slow the Allied advance. German directives in this sector required the army to hold west of the Rhine for as long as possible, to make each Allied step forward costly in time and casualties, and to preserve opportunities for counterattacks if the attackers faltered. Facing them was 1st Canadian Army under General Harry Crerar. Despite its name, it was not made up only of Canadians. Under its headquarters served Canadian Corps and divisions, British and Polish divisions, and attached units from other Allied nations. It was a multinational field army, operating within Montgomery's wider army group on the left wing of the Allied front in northwest Europe. Crerar was not someone the newspapers focused on. Contemporary observers describe him as a quiet professional who rarely sought interviews, avoided theatrical gestures, and preferred careful staff work and methodical planning to sudden flashes of inspiration. From the Normandy campaign through the fighting in the Scheldt, his orders and planning papers show two consistent preferences: heavy artillery preparation before major attacks and a strong reluctance to approve operations that he thought would cause avoidable casualties. Many British officers later characterized him as cautious, sometimes too cautious for their taste, while Canadian veterans often recalled that same caution as one of the reasons more of their comrades survived the European campaign. Relations between Crerar and Montgomery could be strained. Montgomery, as Army Group Commander, had a reputation in British and Canadian sources as a successful battlefield leader who was very conscious of his public standing, quick to criticize subordinates, and used to tight control over operations. Crerar, as the senior commander of a Dominion army, expected a degree of autonomy and, according to later memoirs and official correspondence, reacted sharply when he felt that Canadian formations were being directed in a way that ignored his judgment. Documents and post-war accounts on both sides point to disagreements over the pace of operations, the choice of objectives, and how hard Canadian units should be pushed. Within that working relationship, the plan for Operation Veritable took shape. British 30 Corps, with divisions such as the 15th Scottish Division in its ranks, was to make the initial assault through the Reichswald. Formations under 1st Canadian Army would then deepen and widen the advance, pushing on toward Gosch, the Hochwald, and the approaches to the Rhine. Further south, United States 9th Army was assigned Operation Grenade, an advance across the Rohr that could only begin once the German-held dams upstream no longer posed a serious flooding threat. Senior planners on both sides of the Allied front knew that weather, river levels, and ground conditions could be as dangerous as German guns. The dams and reservoirs on the upper Rohr had been on Allied target lists and intelligence summaries for months, and there was no mystery about what would happen if the sluices were opened at the wrong moment. If released water peaked at the same time as a river crossing, it could wash away bridges and flood newly seized bridgeheads. For that reason, the start of the American crossing was tied closely to readings of the water level and to air and ground attacks on the dam structures. When German forces did open sluices and demolish parts of the dams in February 1945, the Rohr Valley south of the Reichswald flooded heavily. The planned date for Operation Grenade had to be pushed back by roughly 2 weeks, and the broad Allied pincer that planners had hoped would move in close step became, in practice, a sequence, with Veritable starting first and Grenade following later. Operation Veritable went ahead on February 8, 1945, on the northern flank. Crerar and his staff, along with the artillery staffs of 30 Corps and 1st Canadian Army, had spent months building up stocks of ammunition and allocating gun tasks. When the fire plan began, more than 1,000 guns, including field artillery, medium and heavy guns, and specialized rocket launchers, opened fire along a front of roughly 40 kilometers. The bombardment lasted for about 5.5 hours and is described in British accounts as one of the heaviest artillery programs they carried out in the West and the largest since El Alamein. Contemporary reports and later memoirs talk about tens of thousands of shells falling on the Reichswald and nearby positions, and about woods, trenches, and field fortifications being smashed apart. German soldiers who survived it later wrote that the barrage was an ordeal, and some compared it unfavorably with fighting they had experienced on the Eastern Front. For the Allied infantry waiting to move in behind it, the scale of the fire was both reassuring and unsettling. It promised that many German positions would already be hit hard, but it also signaled that the opposition was expected to be strong. Once the guns began to shift their fire deeper into German positions, the ground assault started. If we imagine a rapid armored dash, we miss what the sources describe about the terrain. The Reichswald in winter was a dense forest cut by drainage ditches, low flooded areas, and narrow tracks. Shelling had brought down trees and left tangled belts of fallen timber. Thawing ground quickly turned to deep mud. Tanks and self-propelled guns had to move along a few usable routes that engineers struggled to keep open. Infantry moved forward on foot through cold water and churned earth. On the Allied side, 15th Scottish Division of 30 Corps advanced into Cleve in the opening phase of the operation, with other British formations alongside it. Canadian units moved up behind and to the flanks and then spread out into their own sectors, fighting around Gok, Kalkar, Moyland, the Hochwald Gap, and later towards Xanten and the Rhine. On the German side, 1st Parachute Army under Alfred Schlemm tried to use the ground to its advantage. Fallschirmjäger divisions, including the 6th and 7th and elements of others, held key positions. Regular infantry divisions filled the gaps between them, and anti-tank and assault guns were sighted to cover the main routes open to Allied armor. The German paratroopers in particular already had a reputation in Allied reports for stubborn defense. Many of their officers and non-commissioned officers had fought in Italy and Normandy. They built strong points in villages and farmyards, turned cellars into firing positions, and tried to use every fold in the ground. Their record was not one of unbroken success. Operations like Crete had been costly, and Monte Cassino had eventually fallen, and they had been forced to retreat on several fronts. But their reputation within both German and Allied sources for aggressive and resilient defense was well established. In the Reichswald and its approaches, progress for the attackers was slow. Units often advanced a few hundred meters, halted to bring up guns and engineers, then moved again. The artillery that had begun the operation continued to fire throughout the battle, hitting identified strong points before each new step. Canadian and British engineers worked under fire to lay temporary roadways, bridge ditches, and repair tracks so that tanks, guns, and supply vehicles could keep moving. Over the next days, the pattern that emerges from unit diaries and reports is not of a sudden breakthrough, but of steady pressure that pushed German positions out of the forest and back, towards successive lines of villages and ridges. Cleve, or Clave, at the northern edge of the Reichswald, became one of the first central objectives in this phase of the fighting. In Cleve, the Scottish infantry of 15th Scottish Division, with supporting armour, pushed into the town through streets that had already been heavily damaged by earlier bombing and shelling. German units, including elements of paratrooper formations, had turned houses and cellars into defensive positions, and many of these posts fought on until they were outflanked or overwhelmed. By the time Allied formations had firm control of the place, both sides had taken significant losses, and the German front in that sector had fallen back toward the next defensive belt around Gok and the high ground of the Hochwald. Farther south, Canadian units from 1st Canadian Army became heavily engaged. The fighting for Gok and for nearby grounds such as Moyland and the Hochwald Ridge showed the character of the campaign. Very clearly, close-range infantry battles, German counterattacks trying to exploit gaps or bad going, and Allied artillery called in quickly to break up those efforts. In Canadian and British memoirs, this phase is often described not as one great clash, but as a string of smaller actions. Clearing a farmhouse that had been prepared as a strong point, pushing through a patch of trees where machine guns had survived the opening bombardment, or bringing field guns forward along tracks that were only just passable for heavy equipment. German units did not simply disintegrate when they were engaged. Many positions were held until the defenders were killed, taken prisoner, or ordered to pull back to avoid encirclement. Others gave ground more quickly and tried to form new lines farther east. The result was a steady day-by-day attrition on both sides. As Operation Veritable continued, Alfred Schlemm and his staff looked for ways to bring some maneuver back into what was becoming a slogging match. German counterattacks were mounted wherever reserves could be gathered, sometimes by battalions of Fallschirmjäger, sometimes by improvised groups of infantry and armour. In several areas, these efforts achieved local gains, pushing Allied units back a short distance, or briefly retaking a village at the edge of the forest. The broader picture, however, moved in only one direction. Each German thrust ran into multiple layers of Allied artillery fire and increasingly well-coordinated Anglo-Canadian fire control. With air superiority and large stocks of ammunition, 1st Canadian Army and British 30 Corps could answer German movements with rapid and heavy bombardments. German formations, short of fuel and restricted in how they could move on the sodden ground and under Allied observation, were gradually worn down. In late February, once the floodwater on the Roa had fallen to an acceptable level, United States 9th Army opened Operation Grenade to the south, beginning its advance across the river on February 23, 1945. Taken together, the Grenade advance and the Veritable fighting in the north produced what Allied planners had originally aimed for, a broad pressure that forced German armies in the Rhineland to defend on more than one axis at once. Coordination between the two operations was not perfect, and the delay on the Roa had given the Germans some time to adjust, but the combined effect was still strategically decisive. Under the steady pressure of Veritable and Grenade, German forces west of the Rhine fell back toward the remaining crossings and bridgeheads. By the time Operation Veritable was formally closed on March 11, 1945, the Rhineland west of the river in Montgomery's sector had effectively been cleared of organized German resistance. The cost of this result was high. 1st Canadian Army alone suffered many thousands of casualties in the Rhineland battles, killed, wounded, or missing, and British 30 Corps took heavy losses in the fighting in the Reichswald and around Cleve. German formations, facing much greater Allied firepower and with little realistic hope of turning the tide, were reduced to the point where many units no longer functioned as coherent fighting formations. For the German side, historians who have studied the records of both operations generally estimate that Veritable and Grenade together caused roughly 90,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, among the forces facing 21st Army Group and United States 9th Army in the Rhineland. Of these losses, more than 20,000 prisoners were taken by formations under 1st Canadian Army over the course of the campaign, spread over weeks of fighting and drawn from a mix of units rather than from a single body of paratroopers. 1st Parachute Army did not disappear at once. It was pushed back to the east bank of the Rhine, badly depleted and reorganizing under continued pressure, but it remained in existence as a headquarters with weakened subordinate formations until later operations carried Allied forces into central Germany. For Crerar's army and the formations attached to it, the Rhineland battles showed what a heavily supported, carefully planned offensive could accomplish and what it cost in men and material. The campaign created the conditions for the later crossings of the Rhine, although other Allied armies would carry out the main assaults over the river itself. After the Rhineland fighting, the senior commanders at the center of this story followed different paths. Bernard Montgomery, as Army Group Commander, remained one of the best-known British generals of the conflict. He had already been promoted to Field Marshal on September 1, 1944. In the final months of the war, he continued to direct British forces in northwest Europe and then took command of the British Occupation Army in Germany, before moving on to serve as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. His own published memoirs and his high public profile meant that his interpretation of campaigns such as Veritable had considerable influence on early English language accounts of the war. Harry Crerar returned to Canada after the war with far less publicity than some of his contemporaries. He received official honors and recognition, but he did not publish dramatic memoirs or try to build a public persona. In the interviews and studies that do exist, he is often shown pointing researchers back to official records and stressing the work of his soldiers rather than his own role. Among Canadian veterans of the Rhineland, his reputation tended to rest on practical details. His consistent insistence on artillery support, his concern for rotation and rest for tired units, and his habit, noted in several accounts, of visiting front-line positions to see conditions for himself. Kurt Student's post-war story took a different course. He survived the conflict and was brought before a British military court, not for anything connected to the Rhineland campaign, but for earlier actions by forces under his command, especially on Crete, where prisoners of war had been killed. He was convicted on several of those charges, sentenced to a term of imprisonment, and released on medical grounds in 1948. After that, he lived in what sources describe as relative obscurity in West Germany until his death in 1978. In post-war writing and popular culture, however, the image summed up by the phrase elite German paratrooper often reappeared with little reference to the regime that had created those units or to the record of some of their operations. Alfred Schlemm and his staff, by contrast, are usually remembered in the histories of the campaign as professional officers who conducted a defensive battle under severe strain, sometimes managing to slow the Allied advance, but unable to change the outcome once Allied material strength and coordination in the Rhineland were fully in place. Operation Veritable as a whole was not a simple duel between one Canadian army and a single mass of elite paratroopers. It was a complicated set of battles fought by multinational forces on both sides over difficult terrain and along a broad front. Even so, some points come through clearly in the record. Preparation mattered. 1st Canadian Army and British 30 Corps brought large artillery resources, detailed planning, and strong engineer support to bear, which did not remove the dangers, but did improve the chances that their infantry and armor could get through each stage. German units with elite reputations were not invulnerable. The Fallschirmjäger divisions fought hard and caused serious losses, but they themselves took heavy casualties, carried out controlled withdrawals when ordered, and were steadily worn down by Allied firepower, logistics, and command systems. Leadership style also played a role. Montgomery preferred close control and deliberate advances. Crerar, working under that framework, argued for thorough artillery preparation and caution over casualties. German commanders such as Student and Schlemm tried to use terrain, training, and local counterattacks to offset Allied strengths, but they lacked the resources to sustain large-scale offensive action. The way credit and memory were distributed afterwards did not always match the balance of effort. British, Canadian, Polish, and other Allied formations all took serious losses in the Rhineland. Yet post-war narratives gave much more attention to some units and commanders than to others. That uneven attention does not change the underlying record of who fought where. Taken together, the fighting through the Reichswald and the wider Rhineland gives one more example of how the war in the West in 1945 was brought to a close, with sustained, heavily supported Allied offensives on one side, German armies trying to hold under increasing losses on the other, and commanders on both sides dealing with the limits of their doctrine, their supplies, and their men. It is therefore not a story of a single brilliant leader or a single enemy figure. It is the story of a hard campaign in which training, organization, and weight of resources eventually broke a force that had once seen itself as highly capable, and of how later accounts of those events did not always line up with the experience of those who were there. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing and click the video on the screen to watch another.